Well, I just want you to know that we put a Maxine Erickson fire insurance rider on our policy this week. Figured it was time that we covered that since we've had 2 incidences now. and so I guess I missed quite an exciting event last week. It was I was actually over at my daughter's soccer banquet at the University of Idaho. They held it Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. So, you know, not the best timing for ministers, but I'm the only minister in the crowd, so it's, you know, that's the way it is, you know. And it was well worth the trip over the river and through the woods to, you know, through the snow and with chains and the whole bit. But we got there and it was great and we enjoyed it. And it's also good to be back where there's no snow and no chains and none of that stuff. And not supposed to be this week either, so I'm not unhappy about that. Well, do you know what would have happened if it had been 3 wise women? Instead of 3 wise men? Well, first is they would have asked for directions. Okay. The second is they would have arrived on time. The third is they would have helped deliver the baby. They would have cleaned the stable, made a casserole, and they would have brought disposable diapers as a gift, as well as gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You know, the wise men story I talked about it a couple of weeks ago, and it's one of those rich sort of stories that has a lot of stuff in it because it's not just about them. It's about really a lot of stuff. And one of the components of that story is the star, and we recognize the star in the story of the wise men as representing wisdom and guidance because the star basically foretold the event and guided them to it. And so this sense of wisdom and guidance that showed up in that event. And, you know, some believe that they never actually made it to the stable, that they actually arrived sometime within the first 2 years, not the first couple of days or the first day or two of the event. And part of that was because of Herod's paranoid, dysfunctional rage that showed up in that experience. He had the children under 2, the male children under 2, put to death, which is kind of part of the story. And why would he go that old if it was just a current sort of experience? On the other hand, Mary and Joseph's home was not Bethlehem, so they were there for the census, right? So they must have gone back home. So the wise men would never have gotten to Bethlehem. So that speaks to the idea that they actually did show up, you know, before the thing happened. On the other hand, Herod had the census. So if he had the census, the count, he knew who had what, and, you know, so there was more information there than was available. And so kind of the conclusion is it really doesn't make any difference because it's not about that anyway. What it really is about is not the experience of trying to figure out the historical context, but it's the experience of taking this story and bringing it into our eternal internal life experience so that we find some meaning and purpose and function and energy that shows up for us and how we can live our life and how we can transform our life. And so when we understand the internal dynamics, then that helps us in our life experience, and that makes the Christmas story, I think, more meaningful. Now, how does that show up? Well, I think there's 2 qualities that are important for us to look at. One is patience, and the other is God awareness. So there's 2 things that show up, is patience and God awareness. Those 2 qualities, which are qualities that must have been inherent within the wise men's experience because they had the patience to travel across the desert and look it up and find him. And they had God awareness. They were willing to listen. They were willing to follow the guidance, internal, external guidance that they had to find the star. So patience and God awareness make the difference. And they show up as wise beings in our consciousness. They help us to travel through our journey in life. They help us to recognize that we are much more than just physical beings, that there's an existential part of our experience. There's a spirit within us. There's a divine presence within us. There is a divine self that's there. And that there is much more to life than that which is lived through our five senses. Through our hearing, smell, touch, taste, speaking. That there's much more to life than we can experience through any of those senses, that life shows up in a much bigger way. And so I think the important thing is to understand is that we all have issues in our life. You know, we live our life as human beings, as sensual beings, and we all have issues that happen. And those issues are present and a context through which the divine has the opportunity to show up in our life. We talk about that all the time, that our life experiences are where the divine can show up. And so we think that it's an issue and we label it bad, and then we open ourselves up to something different. The divine shows up and we find out that really it was guiding us to something that was much greater than we could have ever possibly imagined in our life had we not stepped forward and opened ourselves up to it. For me, these issues often show up as temptations to assert myself. That, you know, being a 5-planet Aries with most fire in my signs, I'm an Aries, Scorpio, Leo, so 3 fire planets. So my impulse, my reaction is to assert myself and to control outcomes. In other words, I want to create my own reality. You know what I'm saying? I want to think it and manifest it in my life. And so I think I know what I want. And so I try to create what I think I want. That's sort of been a pattern in my life. And it's interesting that much of our unity teachings support that if we see them through the eyes of our 5 senses. And this is one of the challenges that, you know, much of the teachings that are in the secular world that show up as motivational teachings are really spiritual teachings that we have taught in unity for 100 and some years that have shown up in the secular culture, and what's missing from them often is the divine component. And so when our when those teachings show up in the secular world, our thoughts create our reality, the law of mind action, thoughts in mind produce after their kind. You've heard them in all kinds of environments and experiences, and when they show up without the component of the divine presence, then they become about control. They become about creating something that we think that we are creating in the world, and yet that is not the truth. So what happens is, my paper sticks together. What happens is that we forget that most of our life, most of the thinking we do is not conscious. That only 10% of the thinking that shows up in our life is conscious thinking. 90% is unconscious. It comes out of our subconscious, which is more of a psychological dynamic, and the component that I was just talking about, our superconscious, which is our divine presence. And so to realize, it's kind of scary sometimes to realize that 90% of our thinking, 90% of what is creating our life comes out of the unconscious part of ourselves. So my conscious thought is only 10% of the components that are creating my life experience. And that's a little scary for somebody who wants to control their reality, right? I mean, it's a little hard to step into that understanding. And so what I realize is that, one of the things I understand is that part of what therapy is about, you know, people who, when we feel like we need to go into therapy, part of what therapy is to bring the unconscious into a conscious place. So it is no longer thinking itself into reality because we have made it conscious and we can change those thinkings. Because as a child, we accept things into the unconscious or the subconscious without question. We don't evaluate. As adults, we tend to evaluate and we take in stuff and we don't retain it unless we think it into our consciousness. But as a child, we just take it all in. We just absorb it and we don't judge it or evaluate it. It's just there. And so as we we work with that stuff and we bring it out into our conscious awareness, then we are able to understand what we are thinking into existence, and we are able to have an impact on it.